Welcome back, everybody. This week, the theme is going to be cardiovascular system, expanding further kind of on what we did in Module 3. Module 3, the part of the cardiovascular system that we hit on would be the blood vessels. This time, we're going to focus on the cardio portion of that, which is relating to the heart. So this first lecture is going to be a lot of anatomy of the heart, pathways through the heart, and then we'll get into some of the physiology. So the cardiovascular system includes the heart and all of the blood vessels. And when we talk about the cardiovascular system, we're talking about the entire volume of blood pumped, a complete circuit throughout the body every single minute. That would be a heartbeat. Something I do need you to keep straight, and we kind of talked about this a little bit last week. Veins carry blood toward the heart and arteries carry blood away. The other thing to remember about this is that veins are carrying deoxygenated blood. So the blood has already been delivered to the tissues. The tissues did that gas exchange at the capillaries, and they're carrying the carbon dioxide back to the heart. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. So I always remember arteries away. Arteries are also carrying oxygenated blood. Now, this is true for most veins and arteries of the body, except for there's going to be one little caveat here in the heart, where veins and arteries, you quite literally need to think about it as toward and away from the heart, because actually the veins are going to be having oxygenated blood in them and the arteries are going to be having deoxygenated blood in them. So this is kind of the rule of thumb that I would go by if it were me. But otherwise, if you can keep it straight, that there is one caveat when we get to the vasculature of the heart itself, that there is one instance where there are veins that carry blood toward the heart, but it is oxygenated, and there are arteries of the heart that carry deoxygenated blood. If you can keep that little caveat straight, then you can also remember the oxygenation factor to remember veins and arteries. There are two different circuits of the body. The systemic circuit is what we kind of talked about last week. So this is oxygen-rich blood being carried out to the entire body. And then we followed a lot of vessels to the arm and the head and the neck and the legs and things like that. That is the function of the left side of the heart. So the left side of the heart, its job is to carry oxygen-rich blood and pump it out to the entire body. The right side of the heart carries oxygen poor blood and pumps it out to the lungs. And remember that the lungs are where the oxygen is picked up. So, the different halves of the heart work very different from each other, with the right side pumping to the lungs, the left side pumping out to the body. The deoxygenated blood is on the right side, and the oxygenated blood would be on the left side. So a little anatomy about where the heart's located. It is situated in the thoracic cage here behind the ribs, kind of situated off a little bit towards the left of median. It sits right above the diaphragm. So here's your breathing muscle, the diaphragm here sitting below the ribs. It sits right above that. It sits anterior to the spine. So the vertebrae would be back here, just behind the sternum. And it is bordered by the lungs. So one lung would sit here, one lung would sit here. It does tilt on an axis kind of towards the left. It is about the size of your fist. There are caveats to that too. Of course, the heart is a giant muscle, essentially. It is an organ, but it's made up of a lot of muscular tissue. And so the harder the heart has to work, the bigger it could be in some individuals. We'll kind of get into some pathologies about that. When we talk about the base of the heart, we're actually talking about the top. So that's the widest portion of the heart is the base. Apex means point. So that's going to be this part right here. This would be the apex. That's just a little bit about where the heart is located. There are some protective coverings over the heart. They're called serous membranes. And in week 1, I touched on the term visceral and parietal. And if you can recall, visceral always means closest to the organ. Parietal means further from the organ, or like covering the surrounding wall. And so the heart actually has 3 membranes to worry about. It does have a visceral membrane, a parietal membrane, but it also has a fibrous pericardium. Now, all of these membranes make up our pericardium. Peri means around, cardium means the heart. And so I like this zoomed in picture here. This is basically just zooming in on this area right here. And here's the heart muscle. So this is closest to the heart. So here's your visceral pericardium, visceral serous membrane. And then it kind of infolds on itself and makes a double layer here. And this one would be the parietal pericardium. Okay, and the easiest way to kind of think about this folding is like if you take a sock, if you're wearing a sock and you roll it down, right? So you have a tall sock and you roll it down to about half or whatever. That would be that kind of infolding on itself. So visceral is going to be closest to the heart tissue itself. Parietal is going to be the outer one. And then with the heart, it needs to be anchored to all of these major blood vessels. And it's also anchored to the sternum and things like that. So it also has this thing called a fibrous pericardium. The fibrous pericardium is going to be very strong connective tissue that anchors it to the surrounding structures. So between the visceral and the parietal pericardium, there's this space called the pericardial cavity. That pericardial cavity is full of fluid. And I kind of just want you to think about the purpose of this fluid. The lungs, we're going to see the same type of situation with a visceral and parietal pleura with a space between and fluid between there. What is the purpose? Well, the heart moves, right? It's constantly beating. And we need it to not rub up against surrounding structures in the body and create friction. And so this is kind of a shock absorber area to absorb that friction to allow for that movement of the heart. So that's kind of the purpose of that. The heart wall is made up of 3 layers, epicardium, myocardium, endocardium. This goes from superficial all the way to deep. Epicardium is going to be the outermost layer. So here are your pericardium layers again. And if we go from, here's your fibrous pericardium, here is your parietal pericardium, and then you also have a visceral pericardium right here. That visceral pericardium is also going to share its name with the term epicardium. So that would be the outermost layer of the heart muscle. Now, this is important because visceral pericardium, I always think of it as like saran wrap or plastic wrap, and it's kind of vacuum sealed to the organ. So that would make sense that would be the outermost layer that's divisible. And then the next layer is the thickest layer. This is going to be your muscular layer. Myo always means muscle. So this is going to be your muscular layer, the myocardium. And then your endocardium is going to be the innermost wall. This innermost wall, this endocardium, that is where blood is touching. So those would be like your chambers of your heart, the inner parts that actually makes contact with the blood. The heart has 4 chambers. The human heart has 4 chambers. We have 2 upper chamber called atria. Each one is called an atrium. And then we have 2 lower chambers, each called a ventricle. And when you talk about right and left, we do need to think anatomically. So this person's right and left. So this would be the right side of the heart. This would be the left side of the heart. So here's your right atrium. Here's your right ventricle. Your left atrium, and it's kind of hidden behind this big vessel here. And then the left ventricle. Okay, and the interesting thing here is look at the myocardium of the right ventricle and look at the myocardium of the left ventricle. So in the first slide, I talked about the purpose of each half of the heart. So this half right here is the right side. This half is responsible for pumping blood to the lungs, deoxygenated blood. This side of the heart is responsible for pumping oxygenated blood out to the body. And so you can imagine that you need a much thicker wall, muscular wall, to be able to pump blood a lot further distance. If you think about anatomy, the lungs are right next door to this heart, right? So this side is pumping to the lungs. It doesn't have that far of a distance to pump. This side is pumping blood out from your head to your toes. And so that muscle needs to be thicker and stronger to be able to pump blood long distance. So here are your atria up here. On the outside of the atria, it's not seen in this picture. Here though, these are called auricles. So they kind of look like little flaps or little ears. Auricles, those are on both atria on the outside. Those are just to help expand the atria cavity a little bit more. It's kind of like if you have a suitcase and you have that expansion zipper, that's kind of what the idea is of the auricle. And we have a right and a left half, which means we have to have some sort of division point here down the middle. And so we have septum, interatrial septum and interventricular septum. The interatrial septum is kind of hidden behind this vessel, but just know that there is a bit of myocardium here, splitting the right from the left ventricle, as well as this interventricular septum, which is myocardium that divides the right from the left ventricle. So that means that blood does not mix from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart. That's the point of these septa. So if we split that direction, we're also splitting the horizontal direction here, the transverse direction. And for that case, we have what are called atrioventricular valves. These can be open or closed. We'll talk about when they're each here in future lectures. But on the right side of the heart here, this valve is called the tricuspid valve. And tri means 3. Cusps are just these little flaps. So there's 1, 2, 3 flaps for this tricuspid valve. And if you were to look at it under or through like an imaging technique, you would be able to see the 3 flaps very easily. It kind of looks like this valve right here with the 3 cusps. So this one's open right now, but this is the tricuspid valve. The bicuspid valve is on the left side. The bicuspid valve, you may have also heard it be called the mitral valve. You can call it either name, it does not matter to me. But here we have 2 cusps coming off of that one. So tricuspid on the right, bicuspid or mitral on the left. The flaps or the cusps of these valves are tethered by these little strings here. So you can kind of see these strings. These are connective tissue, kind of like tendons. Those are called chordae tendineae. And the chordae tendineae are attached to these little projections. These are muscular projections. These are called papillary muscles. Okay, so each cusp of each valve has chordae tendineae that anchors that cusp to a papillary muscle. Okay, now the point of these is when this valve is closed, we don't want these cusps coming in and up into the atria. If you think about an umbrella, and you've all seen an umbrella kind of be flipped up like this, right? And like maybe really strong winds or something like that, right? We want that umbrella to stay tented down into the ventricle. We don't want it to come up like this too far, because then what's going to happen is blood from this area is going to creep back up into blood of this area. And what we'll find out is that blood needs to go from atria to ventricle, not from ventricle to atria. And so the point of those chordae tendineae and those papillary muscles is to keep those cusps at a kind of flat transverse line when they're closed. Now you can imagine that they're kind of like rubber bands, right? And the more that a rubber band gets stretched out, the less elasticity it has. And so if these chordae tendineae got really weak, then those cusps could creep up into that atria, and now we would have backflow, and that is not good. That is a certain disease or pathology. I'll give you an example here in just a little bit. So those are the atrioventricular valves: tricuspid, bicuspid, atrioventricular, atria, ventricle between the two. We call them atrioventricular or AV valves. Now we also have 2 semilunar valves. The 2 semilunar valves, one is here. That's called the pulmonary valve, leading into this big blue vessel. The aortic valve is not seen in this picture. It should be seen in another picture coming, but it's going to be about here, going this direction up into this aorta. So the aortic valve is here. It would go into the aorta. The pulmonary valve separates blood from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk, the aortic valve divides the left ventricle from the aorta. So here's an example of when those chordae tendineae get weak. If you've ever heard of mitral valve prolapse, that would be a good disease clinical correlation. 6% of the US population suffers from this. And basically what happens is here's normal. So here's those chordae tendineae, allowing those valves, those mitral valves, which is the bicuspid valve, to close properly. Now that's important because once this ventricle squeezes, it's going to pump blood this direction. And we don't want it going back through the atrium. We want it going into the aorta, because remember that the purpose of the left ventricle is to pump blood out to the body. The aorta is the biggest artery of the body. So those cusps have to be closed with the correct amount of tension coming from those chordae tendineae. Now, if those chordae tendineae get weak or get stretched out, now those valves can go up into the atrium kind of like this. And you can see how those cusps don't make that nice straight closure. And so now when this ventricle squeezes, some blood might leak back up into that atrium. The biggest problem with this, well, there's a couple different problems with this. First of all, if we have some blood creeping back into the atria, that's blood, oxygenated blood that's not getting pumped to the body. So now tissues of your body are being compromised and not getting the correct volume of blood, and therefore oxygen concentration to all of your tissues. The other problem is that this blood just kind of goes back and forth between atrium and ventricle, some blood, and it sits there. And the longer the blood sits here, the more at risk for clots you are, and the more at risk for infection you are, because the blood does have a certain amount of bacteria in it. And the longer that this blood just kind of sits there, kind of like stale blood, the more at risk for infection. So a big complication of mitral valve prolapse is infection of the valves here, or endocarditis. Symptoms of mitral valve prolapse: chest pain, palpitations, fatigue. They can fix this, they can replace that valve. But that would be a good clinical correlation on a problem with not only the valve, but also the chordae tendineae that are kind of controlling the tension on that valve. All right, so the heart is tissue as well. So we talked about the heart and how it's important to pump blood out to the tissues of the body, but the heart needs to stay alive as well. And so the heart needs oxygenated blood too. And those vessels that supply the heart muscle itself are going to be called coronary arteries. So you've all seen these vessels lying all over the top of the heart, right? These are going to be your coronary vessels. So we're going to start with the arteries. So the arteries are carrying oxygenated blood to the heart muscle itself, delivering oxygen to the heart muscle. And the two main arteries to talk about first are going to be the right and the left coronary, and they come off the ascending aorta. So here is the aorta. This first portion exiting the heart is called the ascending aorta. Okay. Now you have one coronary vessel coming here. Oops, excuse me. That's going to be the right coronary artery. The left coronary artery also comes off of the ascending aorta, but it goes behind this pulmonary trunk, and then it'll come out right here. So this is where you can see it, but just know that that vessel did come off of the aorta right here. So we have the right coronary vessel coming off, going to the right side of the heart. We have the left coronary vessel coming off to the left side of the heart. Those are going to be arteries. So oxygenated blood, some of it that's going through that aorta is going to come out and feed the heart muscle itself and keep it alive. A couple branches that I'd like you to know off the right coronary artery. So if we follow the right coronary, we will see a right marginal branch, which is going to be on the side. Marginal always means side. And you notice that you have some vessels here too. We're going to skip those. But if you follow this right coronary artery here and the one clear over on the side, we're going to call that the right marginal branch. Okay. Now, if we keep following that coronary vessel, that right coronary artery around the heart, where we're going to end up is right here on this left picture, or excuse me, the right picture. And that's kind of going down the middle of the back of the heart. That is called the posterior, so back, interventricular, because it's actually sitting right on the division between the two ventricles, right and left halves, artery. So this is the posterior interventricular artery. Okay, and that was all off of this right coronary. So if we follow this right coronary, we come over here. The one I want you to know would be marginal. And if we keep following that around, so here your marginal would be about here. If we keep following that around, then we're going to have the posterior interventricular. Okay, now if we follow the left coronary artery, look at where the left coronary artery goes. It goes down the middle on the front side. Okay, this is between the two ventricles. So we call this one anterior interventricular artery. Now, another name for this would be the LAD, or the left anterior descending artery. I tell you that because that LAD is a common term they use in the medical world, especially cardiology world. If you have a heart attack in this artery, we call that the widowmaker. Not a lot of people survive a heart attack in that specific artery, but this is going to be the anterior interventricular. Now, if we keep following that left coronary around the heart, where we're going to be here is following something called the circumflex branch. So the circumflex branch comes around the heart, like the circumference of the heart. So if we follow this one around, going that way, around towards the back, that's called the circumflex. The circumflex then will come around and, come around and eventually there is a marginal branch here as well. We're not going to talk about that one, but eventually what will happen is both of these coronary vessels will actually meet here at the posterior interventricular. So essentially they're divided here at the front, right? There's nothing connecting the right and the left coronary here, but they will connect in the back. And that is called collateral circulation. So it's kind of like a basketball hoop. So they're not connected in the front here, but they are going to be connected in the back and both drain kind of into this posterior interventricular. Now, what's the benefit of collateral circulation? Well, the heart does a really nice job of redirecting blood flow if one of these arteries is blocked. And so if one of these arteries is blocked, what can happen is the heart will either redirect that blood flow into a different artery that can feed the same area of that heart so that that muscle doesn't die, or it can actually create new vessels, new vascular pathways. So that's kind of the idea of collateral circulation. The heart muscle is very smart in that way. So where there's arteries, there's also veins, and veins are going to drain the deoxygenated blood. So again, these arteries are going to deliver oxygenated blood to these tissues. They're going to do gas exchange at the capillaries, which would be microscopically like here. And then the deoxygenated blood is going to flow through veins back into the heart. Now, where does it all flow into? It flows in right back here. So here are the major veins of the body, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And that's kind of the area where all of the deoxygenated blood from the heart tissue itself is going to flow in as well. This is called the coronary sinus. Sinus always means kind of like a big vessel, a big vein. And so this is called the coronary sinus. So that's where all this deoxygenated blood is actually going to flow directly into the right atrium. The great cardiac vein, I'm going to do this kind of in partners. Okay. So the great cardiac vein runs with the circumflex artery. So here's your great cardiac, which is going to be here. So if we keep following this coronary sinus around the left side of the heart here, remember we were following the circumflex branch, which was a branch off the left coronary artery, but the vein that runs with that, we call that the great cardiac vein. And if we follow that great cardiac vein around to the front here, where do we end up? We end up at the anterior interventricular area. So you can call that the great cardiac vein, or you can call it the anterior interventricular vein. It does not matter. Remember that some veins have a little bit different names than the arteries. And Likewise, we have a posterior interventricular vein back here. So here's your coronary sinus again, and here is your posterior interventricular vein, also called the middle cardiac vein. It does not matter which term you use. Now, just keep in mind, you also have marginal veins as well, but the two main ones that I want you to know, or three main ones I want you to know, are the coronary sinus. If we follow that around the left side of the heart, we will end up in the front here, and we will become the great cardiac vein, or anterior interventricular vein. And that one goes with the circumflex. And then we also have, off the coronary sinus coming straight down the back, we have the middle cardiac vein, or also called the posterior interventricular vein. And then note that that would also have a branch going around the side here, up to kind of onto this marginal side, but we're not going to name any of those veins. Okay, those are your coronary vessels that I'd like you to know. Clinical correlation for you. So what is a myocardial infarction? That is a really fancy name for saying you are having a heart attack. And that is typically caused by a thrombus. And remember, what a thrombus is a stationary blood clot. And here you can see that this artery, this coronary artery, has a lot of plaque buildup on the sides. So if you are obese, unhealthy, have high cholesterol, something along those lines, you may have plaque buildup on the inside of this coronary wall. Now, remember from last week that the smaller the diameter of that lumen, or this opening here, the smaller the diameter, the harder it is for blood to flow through there. And also recall that the inner lining of the arteries are very smooth to prevent blood from sticking. But if we have something foreign, like a foreign substance here, like plaque, then that gives the blood cells something to kind of stick to, something to hold on to. So here, a blood clot has formed in that coronary artery, and what that does is stops blood flow from going through that coronary artery. Remember, arteries are delivering oxygenated blood to the heart muscle itself. So that's very dangerous, because anything beyond this clot is going to die because it's not going to receive oxygen. So for example, here, this is a clot in the left coronary artery, the descending branch here, or the anterior interventricular. This would be like that LAD that I talked about. Here's the clot. So everything below that's going to be compromised. So that heart muscle is going to be dying off. Now, I said sometimes if there's a blockage, you can have some rerouting of blood vessels, formation of new blood vessels. But this specific artery is a very big artery. So that would be a lot of collateral circulation to account for. But in some smaller vessels, that's definitely the case where you may not have as severe of outcome. Here is a cardiac cath procedure where they go in and they light up all the blood vessels with dye, a contrast. And you can see here that where it's dark, that is indicating blood flow. And this would be that anterior interventricular artery. And notice here, we don't have blood flow, good blood flow. So what they'll do is they'll go in, they'll put a stent in. And the best way I can describe a stent, it's kind of like a wire cage, a wire mesh. It almost looks like the spring out of a ballpoint pen. And they'll put that in there, and then that will open up that vessel and kind of clear it out so that blood flow can be restored. So that's post stent. So they're lighting up those vessels again, and now they can see that they've restored blood flow. So that's a cardiac cath procedure. People are lucky if they make it that far. You know, the time of onset of symptoms to cath is very important because the longer that takes, the more heart muscle is dying and cannot be kind of reversed. All right, so that's the heart anatomy. Now we need to talk about how blood flows through the heart. And I'm going to start with the deoxygenated blood coming to the heart. And this is a one-way pathway. So we have unidirectional flow. If anything goes backwards, that is abnormal. That is a disease pathology. So what happens here is that we have deoxygenated blood from the body Okay, so imagine that the body has done its gas exchange at the capillary level, and that venous blood is coming back to the heart via all the veins that we talked about last week and entering the heart, the right side of the heart. We always start in the right atrium, from the superior and inferior vena cava. So all the blood here from the lower part of the body, all the blood here from the upper part of the body, deoxygenated, comes back through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, and those drain into this right atrium here. Okay, now I'm going to stay on this page here because this is a really great diagram. But I'm going to go through those steps on that slide. So in deoxygenated blood comes to the right atrium via the superior and inferior vena cava. And here's the opening of that coronary sinus, by the way, which is the coronary deoxygenated blood coming into the right atrium. Okay. Now, blood always moves from atrium to ventricle. So, and it's unidirectional. So we're going to pass through this valve here, which is that tricuspid valve. And that blood is going to come into the right ventricle. Now, we know that ventricles pump blood either to the lungs or to the body. And in this case, the right side of the heart pumps blood to the lungs. And so this right ventricle is going to squeeze, push blood through this valve, which is that pulmonary valve, into this big vessel, which is the pulmonary trunk. And that pulmonary trunk is going to divide into a vessel going this direction and a vessel going this direction. And notice this one just went through the arch of the aorta and it's in the back. Those are pulmonary arteries. Now, notice that they're blue. So you cannot rely on color here to tell you if it's an artery or a vein for this portion. In addition, on that first slide, when I said there's a caveat to the idea that arteries carry oxygenated blood and veins carry deoxygenated blood. In this case, this is actually an artery that's carrying deoxygenated blood. It's an artery, it's traveling away from the heart. Okay, so that's the idea that you have to think about when you think about these pulmonary vessels, the artery and the veins. So we have a right and a left pulmonary artery, which are going to carry that deoxygenated blood out to the lungs. Okay. Now, at the lungs is where we pick up our oxygen. So now the lungs are going to do their thing, and we'll talk about that next week, of how oxygen gets into the lungs. Then the oxygenated blood needs to come back to the heart because we need to pump that out to the entire body. And there are 4 pulmonary veins here. So you see these 2 little red vessels on this side and these 2 little red vessels on this side. Those are going to be your pulmonary veins. So again, they're red, but they're veins because they're carrying blood back to the heart, toward the heart, okay? Now, these pulmonary veins are going to empty into the left atrium. And we always go from atrium to ventricle. So we're going to pass through this valve, which is that mitral valve or that bicuspid valve, into that left ventricle. And here's that thick-walled left ventricle. We know that that chamber pumps blood out to the body. So it's going to squeeze. We're going to pump blood through a valve, which is hidden behind the pulmonary trunk right here. But there's a valve back here called the aortic valve. Pump blood into the ascending aorta, aortic arch. Okay. And then there's going to be branches off of that, like what we went over last week, right? The brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid, the left subclavian, and then that descending aorta, which will feed all of the abdominal organs, and then down to the legs. Okay. That is the pathway through the heart. Oxygenated and deoxygenated. So the thing to remember again is that the right side of the heart receives deoxygenated blood from the body, pumps that blood out to the lungs. At the lungs is where the oxygenation happens, and those lungs deliver or send the blood back to the left side of the heart. And then that left side of the heart is responsible for pumping that blood out to the body, that oxygenated blood out to the body. So if you can kind of keep that straight, I would encourage you to do a lot of practice with this. Write out the steps of blood flow through the heart. I always like to start with that superior and inferior vena cava, delivering deoxygenated blood to the right atrium, and then go from there. Include all valves when you do the pathway of the heart, because those valves are very important. They have to open to allow blood to pass to the next step. And this is kind of what this looks like in a diagram form, a systemic and pulmonic circulation idea here. So again, this is going to be systemic vessels of, this is representing systemic vessels of the upper body. This is representing systemic vessels of the lower body. Now, last week we drew in all of these veins and arteries. So we know that this isn't exactly what it looks like, right? But this is just indicating all of those systemic vessels that we did last week. So all of those are going to deliver deoxygenated blood through the inferior vena cava, the superior vena cava. Those are going to empty here into the right atrium, passing through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Right ventricle squeezes, pushes blood through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk, which divides into right and left pulmonary arteries. And you can see those actually going out to the lungs, those arteries. Then gas exchange happens at the pulmonary capillaries. Pulm means lung, by the way. Then the oxygenated blood from the lungs come back through a couple pulmonary veins on each side. Those empty into this left atrium, pass through the bicuspid or mitral valve, into the left ventricle. This one actually does show the aortic valve here. So left ventricle squeezes, passes through the aortic valve, ascending aorta, aortic arch, again, systemic, right? These would be all the branches of the aorta. This would be descending aorta down to the lower part of the body. So that is the pathway of blood through the heart. With that, anatomy, I am going to move into physiology. We're going to break up the physiology into electrical physiology and mechanical physiology, and then we will go from there.